John Wesley, in the year 1739, wrote in the preface to Hymns and Sacred Poems that the gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social religion, no holiness but social holiness. And what he meant, of course, was that it's in our relationships with other people, with society, which is what that is, other people, right? It's in our relationships that holiness is expressed. It's lived out. Wesley says you can't do some of that all by yourself, right? How do you practice patience and forgiveness if there's not other people around to be patient with, to forgive, right? We need other people. We need relationships. We need the larger society to help us to grow in holiness and to express that holiness. And so Methodists are fond of saying there's no holiness, or the gospel knows of no holiness, but social holiness. And that has been one of the kind of motivating ideas that has led the Methodists to be such an active and activist people, being involved in all kinds of reform movements and educational movements and missionary movements and disaster response ministries and all that good stuff. Methodists are kind of roll up the sleeves and get your hands dirty kind of people, which is a good thing. We need to be active and we need to be out there. And I think John Wesley is quite right. The holiness that we see in Jesus is always a holiness that expresses itself in relationship. There's no holiness but social holiness. And as I've been thinking about that quote and reading some other things, it's occurred to me that the reverse, of course, is also true. There's no social holiness without holiness on the inside, right? We've got to deal with the inner demons and the inner issues in order to work together with other people in ways that are going to be constructive and lasting. And I think in the 20th century, so a couple hundred years after John Wesley, Christianity in many circles has gotten so focused on the social aspect that we can, and there's like conservative and progressive or liberal forms of this, we can be tempted to reduce Christianity to like a political platform or something like that. And it's all about fixing things out there and making systems right. But we can't accomplish any of that if we're not also addressing the things in here. And of course, John Wesley agreed with that. And I wanted to share two quotes kind of along these lines. Both are from important 20th century thinkers. And like John Wesley, they're actually both Anglicans. One is from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. And this is what he writes. Almost all people at all times have agreed, in theory, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well have not thought at all, unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being. We're only deceiving ourselves. So Lewis is saying you've got to have the inward transformation for the social transformation to even be possible, or the transformation of our relationships with the people around us. So then he says, what is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think, and think hard, about improvements in our social and economic system. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system, but as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. So we have a lot of people with grand ideas for how to make society more just and equitable and all that stuff, but a lot of those ideas, when you listen to it, is all about passing new rules, making new laws. But Lewis's point is that's not going to fundamentally change anything as long as we are still rule breakers and lawless on the inside. Until you deal with that in our hearts, you're not going to get that kind of just society. And another thinker who says something along very similar lines is Michael Ramsey, who wrote this little book introducing Christian faith. Michael Ramsey was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Anglican Church. And this is what he writes. He says, and I put in my notes, you cannot get social justice without spiritual renewal. This is what he writes. But let me tell a story which shows all this in perspective. There was once a man who had 3 nasty big boils. He went to a doctor and asked for each one of them to be treated or removed. And the doctor said, "My dear fellow, I can do nothing permanent with those boils unless we get rid of the poison in your system which is causing them." So too, says Michael Ramsey, the human race, very sick and having at least 3 terrible boils in the social and moral order, wants to be rid of them, because it would be happier without them. But this human race does not grasp that the trouble is a poison in the system, and the sickness is that of deep derangement in the relationship of mankind to the Creator. And some of the worst boils are the ones which the patient has not yet noticed to be there. Go to the root. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God, said the prophet Micah. Far and wide, men and women try fitfully to do the first and the second, and push aside the third. So justice is blind, and mercy too, often calculating and patronizing. The root of this is the right relation of man to the Creator. And when Christians are concerned about what they call worship, they are concerned not with something remote or escapist, but with the root of the world's predicament. Go to the root. It is God alone who comes to put us right. He taketh the simple out of the dust and lifteth the poor out of the mire. Psalm 113, verse 7. I've often thought about that quote from the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. It's sometimes even called the great requirement. What does the Lord require of you, says the prophet to the people? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And it seems to me, as I've heard people quote that verse or preach on that verse or invoke those words, they often kind of are like, do justice, yeah, love mercy, woo, and walk humbly with thy God. And it's kind of like walking humbly with thy God is sort of an afterthought to the like justice and mercy stuff. There's the social program we want to bring into place, without realizing, as Michael Ramsey says, that you won't get that to work if you don't get the other thing right, the walking with God thing, the worship thing, coming before God with humble hearts, seeking His help, His guidance, submitting ourselves humbly because He's God to what He says, and then other things fall into place. Then other relationships are renewed. Then our relationships more broadly in society are transformed. So woe to us if we try to have renewal of social holiness or justice and mercy without also remembering to walk humbly with our God. That's Micah chapter 6, verse 8, worth meditating on, especially if you like to go out there and fix things and set things right. We got to remember where the root is, as Michael Ramsey says. Where's our starting point? We got to address the inner workings of the ship if we're going to steer it in a way that is actually helpful. So, those are my thoughts on that. We have no holiness that's not social holiness, but if we want social holiness, we must also pursue worship, right? We must pursue the love of God if we're going to be able to love our neighbors. Now, that's why love the Lord your God is the first and great commandment. Well, those are my thoughts on that. Until we connect again, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you always. Amen.